Hello and welcome back to South Park Explained on No Bullshit. Today we finally get to talk about the latest, newest, and greatest episode of South Park, which premiered just a few nights ago. This season is ramping up to be a really good one too, as this episode has shown that South Park is still going to stay extremely topical, relevant, and in tune with current events and political issues. That's also what makes this Explained show here on No Bullshit so interesting too, as we have lots to talk about while discussing their stories, themes, and ideas, which tie right into other videos and stories we've covered here on this channel on a regular basis. For example, today's South Park episode is called Mexican Joker, and it obviously references the Joker movie coming out next week, which is also a topic I did a video on just yesterday. In addition, climate change comes up in today's episode too, and there's even some subtle references to Greta Thunberg and other children who are being used and manipulated by their parents and adult handlers. ICE and their detention centers come up here too, and become a main part of today's story as well. So let's quit teasing things and get right into this new episode. Things start off with a brand new introduction for the show. Instead of running the usual South Park intro with their signature original Going Down the South Park song, this year, with the 23rd season just beginning, it starts with a remixed version of the intro. Instead of singing Going Down to South Park, the song says Going Down to Tegrity Farms, and it has a new country hillbilly style of music to go along with it too. Tegrity Farms is of course a callback to an episode and storyline from last season, where Stan's dad Randy decided to move the family out of South Park into a farm just outside of town. There they grow a certain green plant that recently just became legal, and this new business for the Marsh family has gone on to make a good living for them too. And apparently the Tegrity Farms plotline is coming back for this new season as well, not only taking over this show's intro but also playing an integral role in this episode today. After the introduction, we see Randy giving an extensive tour of his farm, which has now expanded greatly, taking up what he calls all of 420 Valley. This tour is reminiscent of a tour at a beer factory or of a winery, except Randy's operation has gotten so big, it's almost like they're touring Walt Disney World or something. Next, inside the farmhouse there, Randy's son Stan is helping him by doing some accounting on the computer, while also in the background we see Cartman laying on the couch saying how he's been bummed out recently. Cartman admits he's depressed now, not only because Stan moved out of town to Tegrity Farms, but also Cartman's worried about the problems his generation is inheriting from their parents, namely the big topic that's been going around this week, you guessed it, climate change. This of course also references the current resurgence of climate change awareness going around this week, and more specifically, the way liberals in the news are trying to scare our children into submission about it. Cartman naturally feels what anyone would feel if they were told the world is going to end in just a few years because of cow farts. South Park is of course goofing on this whole idea, and it started off by showing how messed up this is to do to children, and it shows what happened to kids and how they might become depressed when they hear this kind of stuff in the public all the time. Next, the second part of this episode's story kicks off here too when Randy enters the room. He takes a look at the numbers Stan has been entering on the computer and discovers their farm is selling way less than it was before. This worries Randy, and it sets him off on a side mission to find out why people in town aren't buying his plants as much anymore. Randy immediately goes to Mr. Stotch's house, his friend and former customer, and he offers him a new product. Also, Randy asks why Mr. Stotch isn't buying their green anymore, and it turns out he and many others in town are starting to grow their own plants in their backyards. This clearly angers Randy since it puts his whole new business in jeopardy, and he's surely losing profits too. This eventually results in Randy storming off here angrily, vowing to get revenge on these former customers for messing with his integrity. Back to Cartman, who's in a convenience store getting a soda. He's still really depressed because of climate change, but he's about to see something that is going to bring his mood around quickly. Outside the store, Cartman witnesses ICE raid a house and arrest some potential illegal aliens. ICE, of course, is the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency, a group of federal cops who crack down on illegals hiding in our country, and they've certainly been portrayed horribly in the media lately too, in light of the liberals being pro-illegal immigration and all. This has resulted in ICE even being called criminals themselves, and being called terrible people, and there's also been calls to end their whole organization. And while South Park obviously goofs on them and this situation a bit here, but they never go nearly as far as the left-wingers on the mainstream media would like them to. Here they're just portraying ICE as exaggerations of what they look like in real life, which is usually older big white dudes with facial hair and over-the-top sunglasses. There's also always at least one ICE girl officer who tends to wear a hoodie, sweatshirt, and glasses too. And all of these details are nice touches and good animations, and they do reflect what you often see of ICE in actual pictures and video on TV. Next comes the fun part when Cartman walks up and sees what's going on at this raid. He overhears the ICE people saying they're taking these these illegals to detention centers. And the reason they came was they got an anonymous tip from a phone call. When Cartman puts all this together, he actually gets kind of happy and excited. He realizes that if he wanted to, he can send anonymous tips, which will then result in ICE raiding the place he suggests. And obviously, Cartman has someone in mind when he's thinking of this. His sworn enemy and the person he hates the most in South Park, Kyle Broflovski. Then the next day, Cartman does as expected. He gives ICE a tip about Kyle's family, which results in them being arrested and eventually sent to detention centers. This, of course, is an exaggeration on what really happens with ICE, making them look like they come in and send people away to jail willy-nilly without reason or cause. Of course, this doesn't happen like this in the real world, but it is a good premise for this joke, and it comes back in this episode a couple times too. Back to Randy's story now though. He's now gone to City Hall where he's hoping the government will help his plant company by banning people from growing plants on their own at their homes. Randy doesn't give this speech or proposal himself though. He instead has his son Stan go up and speak for him. And this part is a pretty obvious reference to Greta Thunberg and how her parents use her to try and get their own ideas and proposals passed too. Sneaky, shady people like this know that putting a child on stage and having them sound scared and worried about an issue might make it seem more important to many, since they would pity a child more and be less likely to criticize them than an adult. And while Greta is fighting for climate change awareness and solutions, Stan is fighting to stop people from growing plants at their homes. Both kids are doing the bidding of their parents secretly too, and their pitches also have hidden agendas that aren't being presented transparently. Then on the way home, Stan even says that Randy's plans will piss off the whole town, much like how Greta's plans will piss off the whole country. Next, Kyle eventually ends up at a detention center in Texas after the ICE raid, and here's where we get our first Trump reference too. Upon entering the center, the ICE workers quickly realize Kyle is not Hispanic like the rest of the kids. When they ask what Kyle's doing there, he says it's because some fat, intolerant asshole doesn't want him around. This prompts a couple of the other kids to start replying, "Me too." And while Kyle is referring to Cartman, the other kids are of course referring to Donald J. Trump, the president. And this is the kind of joke that many might expect a conservative like me to get mad or triggered about, but as usual, when it's done by South Park, I feel quite the opposite. Even when they make fun of things I support or believe in, like Trump here, and ICE before this, well, it's done in such subtle, nuanced, and often indirect ways that I can't help but get on board with it too. It also turns out to be so funny, so I personally can just go with it and have a laugh, even if I do disagree with some of the core premises at times. Of course, ICE is just doing their jobs, and Trump isn't necessarily intolerant like you would think, but these exaggerations and quips that go along with them happen so naturally and are so underplayed that only the most stuck-up and sensitive of people would really get triggered here, at least according to me and according to my own sense of humor. I can take a joke because I'm used to hearing them and dishing them out too, and I only take umbrage with some of the shittier comics that do this in bad ways and who are doing it so badly it's overtly politically motivated and more influenced by their left-wing side and its politics. South Park isn't like that at all though. They hardly take sides politically ever because, as with all good comedians, South Park loves to goof on everyone on any side almost equally, and they'll have a laugh at anyone's expense too. Next, we finally get to the episode's main plot point, and we figure out why it's called Mexican Joker. After ICE discovers Kyle shouldn't be there, they take him into the back office to sort things out. The leader promises to send Kyle back home immediately, but then Kyle turns to ask what about the other kids there. Kyle then warns ICE that they could be creating a monster here. Taking in families, particularly kids, could be traumatizing to them, and it will inevitably cause them to not only fear the police and government, but also those feelings might stew over time for years and result in some of these people turning into sorts of villains who will want to get revenge on the police and the government and the United States. ICE doesn't quite understand this idea at first though, so Kyle then decides to explain it in simpler terms with an analogy to superhero and comic book movies. When you think about it like that, the stuff that ICE is doing now is the kind of stuff you hear about in a supervillain's backstory. They were once normal kids too, who eventually had something bad to them like getting kidnapped and then traumatized, which then turns these people into supervillains. Or what Kyle says here, and what he calls it, is they could be creating a Mexican Joker. This of course is a very relevant idea and concept, based on the exaggerations of these situations. And also, the Joker reference is of course coming now because there's a new Joker movie coming out next week, which has been the source of much talk and controversy lately. That movie portrays the backstory of one of Batman's greatest villains. And today, in this South Park episode, Kyle is suggesting that their version of ICE could be creating a Hispanic version of Joker, or as they like to put it, again, a Mexican Joker. Hilarious idea and a great name for a character, and for a title of an episode. And it's something that ties together two modern day pop culture references together so artfully and so skillfully, It's kind of like watching Michelangelo paint the Sistine Chapel, or watching Michael Phelps swim and win the 100-meter butterfly. Yes, South Park is certainly on top of their game here, and they're in true form, and they're doing the best you can do, especially in terms of topical comedy shows and cartoons with a bit of an edge. After this Mexican Joker revelation, we get a quick second reference to Trump when one of the cops says they're just trying to make America great again. Next, the ICE workers struggle with this Joker premise, fearing Kyle could be right and they could be making a villain who could come back to fight them in the future. Funny enough though, the actions ICE ends up taking to try and prevent creating a Joker actually end up being ways that could make it happen even worse. First, the lead cop puts on an awkward puppet show, where he even makes a little Joker puppet who he makes act out a crime against an innocent girl puppet. This was done in hopes to discourage this kind of thing from happening, but I see this as possibly causing it by putting the idea into the kids' heads early on. And later, the cops then try to use electric shock therapy to erase the kids' memories, so they won't remember getting raided and locked up like this. But this, of course, is another thing that could just as easily cause the kids to become villains itself. Kind of reminds me of how Bucky Barnes was brainwashed for years, before becoming the titular villain in Captain America: Winter Soldier. Back to Kyle, who now discovers that Cartman has been sent to this detention center too. And when Kyle's best friend Stan discovered what Cartman did to him, Stan decided to get revenge by sending Cartman away as well. Cartman is still in good spirits though, and despite getting arrested, he starts singing and dancing. He seems to take joy in being there, even doing some musical numbers and down on your luck songs like It's a Hard Knock Life from Annie. Kyle then gets frustrated with Cartman and this whole situation at large, so that results in him coming up with a plan to save them all. Back to Randy's farm story, he eventually teams up with a big plant-growing corporation. They intend to take out all the private homegrown farms any way possible, and this leads to a later scene where bombs go off in everyone's backyard in South Park. The private farms and plants have been destroyed then, but the town is now in a panic because of it. Next, we cut to a news report about the explosions, and quickly the reporter announces that the main suspect is none other than Mexican Joker. This prompts an interview with a military person who warns the town about future issues, and also he leads into what's supposed to be a flashback, turning back to the origin of this Joker villain. This flashback leads back to the ICE detention center, where the officials discover Kyle enacting his escape plan. He's taken all those space blankets that look like aluminum foil, and he's cut them up and turned them into Jewish yarmulkes and put them on everyone's head. Now, Kyle's enacting a ceremony that will turn everyone into Jews, because that way, ICE will care about the people there more and let them out of their cells, at least according to this story. In the end, the ICE leader attempts to let all the kids out of the holding center, because he wants the one that eventually becomes Joker to have mercy on him in the future. Finally, Kyle says that's not what he meant before at all, and also, the future's not set quite yet. The actions we take now affect the future and can change if we do the right thing. But this doesn't get the reaction he hoped for, as the cop then decides he's in the wrong flashback and then runs off, leaving the kids all locked up there. Back at Tegrity Farms, Randy enjoys his victory. With all the private farms destroyed and the town in a panic, Tegrity Farms becomes the main supplier of plants once again. But although Randy won, he still lost a part of his soul going down this route. He's sold out, as the character Tally mentioned in a scene earlier. Now, with all that said, we've clearly seen another classic, very relevant South Park episode, with a possible cliffhanger and continuing story arc set up too. I think for the most part, the ICE and Joker stuff might be over here, but the Tegrity Farms storyline seems like it might carry on in some other ways. I also admit there's probably more to the whole selling out and stopping private growers part of this story. There's probably more to it that I don't quite understand yet fully. It might be a reference or an analogy of some sort to something bigger, like how they alluded to climate change earlier and paralleled Stan with Greta. Climate change and its fear and the fear of the Joker here are being used by other people for other personal goals, so maybe there will be more to that next week, or maybe more is coming in the future during the season. Either way, I can't wait to see what's in store for South Park coming up next week and throughout the rest of this year. What do you guys think? Did you enjoy this episode as much as I did? What was your favorite part here? And do you think any of these plot points are coming back in the future? Comment your thoughts on everything before, and if you want to see more South Park explained, make sure you hit that like button on this video. Let's see if we could get, say, 4,000 likes for this new season, which will help us continue our coverage next week. I will be traveling and out of town for a few days next week too, so South Park Explained might be delayed for a few days, but we will have the episode coming probably on the following Monday, so stay tuned and have no fear. More South Park is on its way here. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you all next time.